If you weren't my boss, I'd hug you right now. The words hang in the air between them like smoke, impossible to take back, impossible to ignore. Noah Carter, 32 years old, single father, a man who hasn't slept more than 5 hours in 3 months, stands frozen on the wrong side of a line he didn't mean to cross. Across the conference table sits Evelyn Sinclair, CEO, the most controlled woman he has ever met. And for exactly 3 seconds, her face does something he has never seen it do before. It breaks open, just slightly, just enough. Then she blinks, and the moment vanishes. Before the story goes any further, if something in those first few seconds already made your chest tighten, you're in the right place. This channel tells the stories that stay with you after the screen goes dark. Hit subscribe so you never miss what comes next. Drop a like if you want Noah and Evelyn to find their way through this. And leave a comment telling me what city and country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to the beginning. Because this moment, this one impossible sentence in a conference room, didn't happen in a vacuum. It was built quietly and painfully over 6 months of 2 people trying very hard not to feel what they were already feeling. The morning Noah Carter walked into Meridian Group for his first day, he was running 11 minutes late and carrying a sippy cup that wasn't his. He'd grabbed it by accident off the kitchen counter, mistaking it for his travel mug in the dark. Ava's purple plastic dinosaur cup, still half full of apple juice. And he didn't realize it until he was already on the subway with no time to go back. So he'd shoved it into the side pocket of his laptop bag and told himself nobody would notice. The receptionist noticed. She was maybe 23, sharp-eyed, and trying very hard not to smile as she handed him his visitor badge. Her gaze had dropped to the small purple dinosaur poking out of his bag and stayed there for just a beat too long. "First day?" she asked. "That obvious?" "Little bit," she said, and finally let herself smile. That was how Noah Carter's tenure at Meridian Group began, with a dinosaur sippy cup and a woman at the front desk being kind enough not to laugh out loud. He'd take it. He'd had worse starts to worse days. This was just Tuesday. He'd found the job through a staffing agency 3 weeks after his previous employer, a mid-sized logistics firm, quietly dissolved its entire operations division and handed everyone a cardboard box and a 2-week severance. Noah had stood in the parking lot that afternoon holding his box, laptop charger, a framed photo of Ava, 3 pens he'd stolen from the supply closet over 2 years, and tried to calculate, in real time, exactly how many months of savings he had left before things became genuinely dangerous. The answer was not enough. He didn't tell Ava. She was 6, and she still believed that when Daddy looked tired, it was because he'd stayed up watching baseball. He kept that fiction going as long as he could, making her lunch every morning, walking her to school, reading her 3 chapters of whatever book she'd dragged out from the library that week. She was burning through them, 2, 3 a week. And her current obsession was a series about a girl who could talk to horses, which meant Noah had spent the better part of a month listening to lengthy summaries of horse dialogue on the walk to school. He didn't mind. He loved it. He loved her so much it sometimes scared him, the specific, terrifying way you love someone who is entirely depending on you to hold things together. So he found Meridian, senior account coordinator, mid-level but stable, benefits from day one. He put on his best suit, cleaned his shoes, and showed up 11 minutes late with a dinosaur cup in his bag. And when the receptionist handed him his badge and smiled at him like that, he thought, okay, maybe this one will work out. He didn't meet Evelyn Sinclair on his first day. He'd heard about her before he walked through the door. Anyone who did 5 minutes of research on Meridian Group encountered her almost immediately. She'd taken over as CEO 18 months earlier at 28, which had generated a certain amount of industry press. And the photographs from that time showed a poised, precise woman with dark eyes and a quality of stillness that seemed almost staged. Noah had read enough of those profiles to understand the rough shape of her story. The car accident 4 years ago, the spinal injury, the recovery that people in those articles described with words like remarkable and inspiring, which he'd always found somewhat reductive, as if a person's most meaningful characteristic could be that they survived something terrible. He didn't form strong opinions about people he hadn't met. His ex-wife had accused him of this once, saying he was too willing to suspend judgment, that he gave everyone too much benefit of the doubt. He'd thought about that a lot since she left. He still didn't think she was right. You had to give people a chance to show you who they were before you decided. He met Evelyn on his third day, in the hallway outside the second-floor conference room. He was carrying 2 binders and a cup of coffee, navigating a hallway that was too narrow for the amount of foot traffic it was handling at 10 in the morning, and he turned a corner without looking and nearly walked directly into her. She moved the wheelchair back just fast enough. He stopped just in time. The coffee sloshed but didn't spill. "I'm sorry," he said immediately, his heart doing something stupid. I didn't see." "I know," she said. "You were looking at the binders." "Yeah. Are those the Hartwell files?" He looked down at what he was carrying. "Yes." "Good. We need those for the 11 o'clock. Do you know where room 2C is?" "Not entirely." "Follow me," she said, and turned back the way she'd come, moving with the kind of efficiency that made it clear she had approximately no spare minutes in her day. Noah followed, adjusting his grip on the binders, and that was that. His first conversation with Evelyn Sinclair. 35 seconds. She hadn't introduced herself. He'd figured it out later from the nameplate outside her office. He thought, she seems very busy. He thought, she didn't make it weird. He didn't think much else about it for the first few weeks. The job itself was harder than he'd expected, and he'd expected it to be hard. Meridian Group managed communications and PR strategy for a cluster of mid to large corporate clients, and the accounts Noah had been handed were the ones in various stages of crisis. A pharmaceutical company dealing with a product recall, a regional bank whose social media manager had made a catastrophic error in judgment, a retail chain attempting to rebrand after a discrimination lawsuit. None of these clients were easy to talk to, and none of them wanted to hear that the solutions were slow and incremental and required patience they mostly didn't have. Noah was good at this, though. He'd learned early in his career that people in trouble didn't want to be managed. They wanted to feel like someone was actually listening, actually engaged with their specific disaster. So he listened. He read everything. He answered emails at 11 at night and was upfront about what was realistic and what wasn't. And gradually, over the first couple of months, his clients stopped calling him in panic and started calling him with questions. It was a distinction he understood how to cultivate. What he hadn't calculated was what the hours would do to his already thin margins at home. He had a system. Mrs. Paulson, the retired teacher who lived in the apartment below his, watched Ava after school for $40 a day, cash, which Mrs. Paulson preferred, and which Noah provided reliably, even when it meant he was eating sandwiches for dinner 5 nights running. He picked Ava up by 6:30, made dinner, helped with whatever had come home from school, read the horse book, lights out by 8:30. Then he had approximately 2 hours before his own exhaustion became non-negotiable, and he used those hours to answer the day's remaining emails and prep for the next morning. It was a treadmill. It worked, barely, as long as nothing went wrong. Things went wrong in the 4th week when Ava's school called at 2 in the afternoon to say she had a fever of 101 and needed to be picked up. Noah was in a meeting with the pharmaceutical client. He spent 45 seconds in a bathroom stall convincing himself it was manageable before going back in and telling the client he had a family emergency and needed to reschedule. The client was not pleased. Noah drove to Ava's school with his jaw tight and his chest tighter, doing the math on whether this would cost him the account, whether losing the account would have downstream consequences, whether he could absorb those consequences, or whether this was the beginning of the unraveling he was always bracing for. He picked Ava up. She was sitting in the nurse's office in her coat, pale and small, and when she saw him, she said, "Daddy, I don't feel good," in a voice so flat and miserable that something in his chest just stopped calculating and broke a little. He sat next to her on the vinyl bench and held her hand and said, "I know, Bug," and didn't think about the client for approximately 20 minutes. He got back to his desk at 4 and found an email from Evelyn. It said, "Noah, I heard about the emergency. I've moved your follow-up with Bartlett Pharma to Thursday morning. I've already let them know. Hope everything is okay." That was all. No commentary, no passive suggestion that family situations should be managed more efficiently. Just, "I moved the meeting. I handled it. Hope it's okay." He sat there for a moment looking at the email. Then he typed, "Thank you. She's okay." Fever broke around 3. Evelyn replied 17 minutes later. "Good. See you tomorrow." He didn't tell anyone about the email. He wasn't sure why. It felt like something private, though he couldn't have explained exactly what made it that way. Oh. November became December. The days got short and cold, and Ava developed a phase of refusing to wear her winter hat, which meant every morning started with a negotiation that Noah only sometimes won. He started keeping a spare hat in his coat pocket. Preparedness, he'd found, was the closest thing to peace of mind that was actually available to him. He was learning Meridian's rhythms. He knew which colleagues to avoid before 9, which conference rooms had the broken overhead light that gave everyone a headache, which elevator was perpetually 2 minutes slower than the others. He knew that Evelyn arrived at 7:15 most mornings and was usually in her office with the door closed until 8:30, and that the closed door didn't mean she was unavailable. It meant she was working, and you'd better have an actual reason to knock. He learned that because he needed to knock one morning in December, when the retail chain client called him at 8 and began working themselves toward a decision that Noah was fairly certain would make their situation significantly worse. He needed authorization to make a counteroffer outside his normal scope. He needed it in the next 40 minutes. He knocked. Evelyn said, "Come in." He came in, explained the situation quickly and without the extra commentary that she clearly didn't need, and waited. She asked 3 questions. He answered them. She said, "Do it. I'll send a follow-up to cover you." He was back at his desk in under 4 minutes. She sent the follow-up before he'd finished his coffee. He started to understand something about the way she ran the company. Not loudly, not with a lot of performance, but with a quality of attention that was, he was realizing, genuinely rare. She kept track of things. She noticed things. She responded to problems with a speed that made it clear she was always already thinking several moves ahead. And she didn't make her people feel stupid for bringing her problems, which in Noah's experience was more unusual than it should have been. The first time he came close to saying something true was in January, at 9:20 at night, when the office had emptied out and he was still at his desk because the Hartwell account, his largest, most complicated, most volatile, had spent the day detonating. The client's VP of Communications had sent an unauthorized statement to 3 journalists. The statement contained 2 factual inaccuracies and one claim that was not technically false, but was the kind of thing that, left unaddressed for more than about 6 hours, would become a much larger fire. Noah had spent the afternoon doing damage control with the journalists, drafting a clarifying release, and having a careful, exhausting conversation with the VP that required him to be very honest about the consequences of what had happened without being so blunt that the man became defensive and stopped listening. He'd gotten it to a stable place. Not resolved, stabilized. There was a difference, and the difference mattered. He was sitting at his desk at 9:20, staring at his monitor, running on 3 hours of sleep and the specific post-adrenaline flatness that followed a day like this, when Evelyn came around the corner. She had a coffee cup in the bag on the side of her wheelchair, and she set it on his desk without asking. "Black," she said. "You look like milk and sugar would be wasted." "Is it that obvious?" "I read the update you sent at 7. She'd stopped at the edge of his desk, not coming fully into his space. "You handled it." "Barely." "Barely still counts." She glanced at his screen. "Anything still open tonight?" "Nothing that can't wait until morning." "Then go home, Noah." He looked at her. "You're still here." I live differently than you do," she said, and there was something matter-of-fact in it that wasn't self-pity and wasn't bravado either, just a statement about the shape of her life that he found he didn't know what to do with. He didn't try to respond to it, because he suspected she wouldn't want him to. "Thanks for the coffee," he said instead. She nodded. "Ava, she's better? You mentioned she had an ear infection last week." He looked up again, a little surprised that she remembered. "Yeah, she's good. Finished the antibiotics Friday." "Good." She turned toward the elevator. "Good night." "Night," he said. He sat there for another few minutes after she'd gone, drinking the coffee, thinking about nothing in particular. The office was very quiet. Outside, the city moved the way it always moved, indifferent and continuous. He thought about Ava asleep in her bed at home, Mrs. Paulson's $40 in an envelope on the counter, the Hartwell account sitting in a state of provisional calm that might or might not survive the morning news cycle. He thought about the fact that Evelyn Sinclair had remembered his daughter's ear infection. He drank the rest of the coffee and went home. February brought a cold that burrowed into the city and stayed. Noah started keeping a second blazer at the office because some mornings the commute left him so windburned that walking into the building in just a shirt felt vaguely unprofessional. He was in a rhythm now, a narrow, precise rhythm, but a rhythm. He knew how to manage his accounts. He knew how to manage his mornings. He knew how to be a father to a child who was bright and demanding and sometimes terrifying in how much she needed from him. What he hadn't accounted for was that Ava was accumulating opinions about Evelyn Sinclair. He'd made the mistake once of mentioning her by name when Ava asked about his day. He'd said something like, "My boss helped me sort out a problem at work." And Ava had asked her name, and he'd said Evelyn, not thinking anything of it. A week later, Ava referred to her as the Evelyn lady and asked if she was nice. "She's professional," he said. "What does that mean?" "It means she's good at her job." "But is she nice?" He thought about it. "Yeah," he said. "She is." Ava seemed satisfied with this. She filed it away somewhere and didn't bring it up again for a few weeks. But the name stuck. And that was the thing about Ava. Things stuck with her. The Hartwell account almost collapsed in March. Not almost. It did collapse for approximately 48 hours. And Noah spent those 48 hours in a state of focused, almost preternatural calm that he didn't entirely understand until it was over and he found his hands were shaking. The client's CEO had spoken off the record to a financial journalist, except the journalist had decided, for reasons that seemed inexplicable until you looked at the timing of an unrelated news cycle, that the off-the-record agreement no longer applied to a certain portion of the conversation. By Monday morning, there were 2 items in business press that were not catastrophic individually, but were catastrophic in combination, and Noah had about 4 hours to build a response strategy before the story got picked up at a wider scale. He did it. He worked with Evelyn. She stayed in the loop for every decision, available at each step without hovering. And he worked with the client, who was rightfully panicked, but responsive when Noah was direct about what was happening. By Tuesday evening, the story had plateaued. By Wednesday morning, a larger story had broken elsewhere in the industry, and the algorithm had moved on. Wednesday afternoon, Evelyn called him into her office. She told him he'd handled the crisis well. She said it directly, without elaboration, in the way she said most things that she meant. He said, "I don't think I slept more than 3 hours either night." "I noticed," she said. "There were emails from you at 2 and 4 in the morning." He'd forgotten she'd be able to see that. He felt briefly self-conscious. "Sorry. Don't apologize for that." She looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite name. "Does Ava know when you're this stressed?" The shift in subject caught him slightly off guard. "She knows something's wrong," he admitted. "I don't know how she knows, but she does. She started sleeping in my bed again Monday night. She said she heard a bad dream." "Did you tell her it was okay?" "I told her Dad was just busy with work and it was going to be fine." "Was that true?" "It is now," he said. Something moved across Evelyn's face then. He wasn't sure what to call it. She looked at him for a moment with a quality of attention that felt different from the attention she gave problems and strategy documents. More personal, more careful. "You're good at this," she said. "At all of it." "The job, or all of it," she repeated. And then the moment closed, the way those moments did around her, efficient and self-contained. "I wanted to tell you that." He left her office a few minutes later and stood in the hallway for a second, not entirely sure what to do with the warmth sitting in his chest. He decided not to examine it too closely. Spring came in uneven, alternating between genuinely warm afternoons and days that were still winter cold and gray. Ava finished her horse book series and moved on to something about a girl detective, which Noah found easier to track, since at least the summaries had actual plot. He took her to the park on a Saturday when the weather was decent, and they fed bread to pigeons, and she told him at length about something complicated that had happened at school involving a misunderstanding about a birthday invitation. And Noah listened and asked questions and helped her work through it. And by the time they walked home, she'd decided the whole thing was resolved and moved on completely. He envied her the ability to do that, to feel something fully and then release it. It wasn't built that way. He held on to things. His wife leaving, for instance, that was 3 years ago, and he still caught himself sometimes at the edge of the thought, turning away from it before it could expand. The practical grief he'd managed. The specific loneliness of being in a marriage that turned out not to be what either of them thought it was. that sat somewhere quieter and more durable in him. He thought about this on the walk home from the park, not entirely sure why it was surfacing now. Ava was holding his hand and singing something she'd learned at school that she'd already forgotten most of the words to, filling in the gaps with sounds that were almost words. He squeezed her hand. She squeezed back without breaking the song. He thought about Evelyn, not for the first time, not in a way he was willing to fully name. And then he stopped thinking about her and bought Ava an ice cream from the cart on the corner, and that was that. The Hartwell contract was up for renewal at the end of May. The client had 3 options on the table, 2 of which were from other firms. Noah had known about this for weeks and said nothing at the office because he had a strategy and he wanted to execute it before anyone started making decisions above his head. He'd spent 3 weeks preparing a renewal pitch that was, he believed, genuinely stronger than anything else the client was being offered. Not more expensive, not more elaborate, just more honest about what Meridian could deliver and what the alternatives probably couldn't. The meeting was the last Thursday of May. He went in with a 16-page document he'd written largely between 10 at night and midnight over the preceding week, and he sat across from 4 executives and pitched for 45 minutes. And when it was over, the lead executive, a woman named Rachel Park, who had spent most of the meeting with her arms crossed, leaned forward and said, "We'll call you by end of day Friday." She called him at 11 Friday morning. They were signing. He walked back into the office carrying what he could only describe as full-body relief, the kind that starts in your legs and works its way up, leaving you slightly lightheaded. He set his bag down at his desk and sat in his chair and exhaled for the first time in 3 weeks. He went to tell Evelyn. She was in the conference room wrapping up another meeting, and she saw his face as he came in, and the last of the other people in the room were still filing out when she looked at him and said, "Well?" "They signed," he said. And he saw it again, the thing that happened to her face sometimes in unguarded moments, the control slipping just slightly, just for a second. She looked at him with something that wasn't professionalism and wasn't just relief about a contract. And the room was still half full of people with their papers and their coffee cups and their coats, and he didn't care about any of them. "If you weren't my boss," he said, "I'd hug you right now." The room went still. Evelyn looked at him. For one long, suspended moment, she looked at him the way she never let herself look at him. All of it visible. Everything she'd kept behind the title and the closed door and the careful professional distance. And his heart was doing something that had nothing to do with the Hartwell account and everything to do with 6 months of coffee cups at 9 o'clock at night and ear infection follow-ups, and her voice saying all of it and meaning something she wouldn't let herself say directly. Then she blinked, and the expression was gone. "Congratulations," she said, and her voice was exactly right, exactly the CEO voice, exactly the appropriate register of professional acknowledgement. And the people in the room smiled and someone clapped him on the back and everything went back to normal. Except nothing felt normal at all. Nobody mentioned what happened in the conference room. That was the thing that made it harder, somehow. If someone had laughed, if a colleague had nudged him in the ribs afterward and said something stupid about it, Noah could have deflected and moved on. If Evelyn had called him aside and addressed it directly, that was inappropriate, let's be professional. He could have apologized and filed it somewhere manageable. But nobody said anything. The moment happened, and then the room emptied out, and the day continued, and by evening it was as if those 7 words had never existed, except they had existed. And Noah knew it, and he was almost certain Evelyn knew it too. He drove home that Friday with the Hartwell renewal signed and sitting in his email in his hands doing something on the steering wheel that was not quite drumming and not quite gripping, some nervous middle state. Ava was at Mrs. Paulson's. He had 40 minutes before he needed to pick her up. He spent those 40 minutes doing exactly what he'd trained himself not to do, which was turn that moment over in his mind looking for something certain. The way Evelyn's face had changed. Not gradually, suddenly, like a window opening. Everything she kept behind the careful exterior, visible for exactly long enough to be undeniable, and then gone. He'd been reading her wrong, maybe. Or maybe he'd been reading her exactly right, and that was the problem. He picked up Ava. She'd made a drawing at Mrs. Paulson's, a cat with 7 legs that she insisted was not a mistake. That was just how this particular cat was. He told her it was the most interesting cat he'd ever seen. She told him she planned to make a whole series. He made dinner. He gave her a bath. He read 2 chapters of the detective book. He turned out the light and sat in the hallway outside her door, in the particular way he did sometimes when the apartment felt too quiet, listening to her breathing even out. He didn't think about the conference room again that night, or at least he tried not to. He was mostly unsuccessful. The following Monday, Evelyn was in a client meeting until 11, and when she emerged, she was already talking to two members of the strategy team, and she passed his desk without pausing, which was not unusual, which was completely normal. She said good morning in the direction of the general office and kept moving. Noah said good morning back and looked at his monitor. Nothing was different. He needed nothing to be different. He needed to be a person who could secure the Hartwell contract and say something stupid in front of 8 colleagues and move on with his professional life intact. I was a 32-year-old single father with unpaid dental bills and a daughter who currently believed cats could have 7 legs if you wanted them to. He did not have the bandwidth for whatever this was. He opened his email. He answered 3 client messages. He was fine. He was not entirely fine. Well, what changed, and changed quietly enough that he almost didn't track it happening, was that June became a different kind of month than the ones before it. Not because anything dramatic occurred, the opposite, almost. The days settled into something more comfortable than they'd been, and the comfort was its own kind of complication, because Noah kept waiting for the discomfort to return, and it didn't. Evelyn had, in some subtle reorganization of her schedule that she never drew attention to, shifted the Friday morning all-hands meetings to 10 o'clock instead of 8:30. He found out about this through the calendar update, not through any conversation, and he spent about 90 seconds before he understood what it meant. 8:30 on Friday was the slot he'd mentioned, once in a passing conversation 3 months ago, when she'd asked whether the meeting times were working for him, and he'd said they were mostly fine except Fridays were complicated because Ava's school started late, and his usual arrangement with Mrs. Paulson didn't kick in until 9. He'd said it and moved on because it wasn't a complaint, just an answer to a direct question. She'd moved the meeting. She hadn't said anything about it. The calendar just updated. He thought about it more than he should have, and then put it away in the category of things he was choosing not to examine. But other things followed. When he mentioned once, again in passing, that the Hartwell account's next review was the same week Ava's school had a performance. She was playing a flower in a thing about the seasons, a role she was taking extremely seriously. Evelyn had restructured the team's schedule for that week, without explanation, putting the Hartwell prep on Tuesday and Wednesday instead of Thursday. He hadn't asked for this. It was just done. He started to notice that she remembered things, small things. Ava's ear infection, yes, he'd already registered that, but also the name of Ava's teacher, which he'd mentioned once in November. The fact that Noah took his coffee black in the mornings but switched to tea in the afternoon, which he'd never told anyone directly. The fact that his hardest client was not Hartwell, but the pharmaceutical account, even though Hartwell was bigger, because the pharmaceutical company's internal communications team was chronically disorganized, and it created downstream problems that were exhausting to manage. She knew these things. She worked around them when she could, and she did it without making him feel like a project, which was the part he found most difficult to sit with, because that took a specific kind of care that people didn't extend without a reason. He knew what the reason probably was. He wasn't ready to say it, even to himself, but he was aware of it the way you're aware of a sound in another room. Present, undeniable, unaddressed. Evelyn Sinclair did not have a version of her life that included room for this kind of complication. She understood this clearly. She'd understood it before Noah Carter showed up with his dinosaur sippy cup and his quiet, persistent competence, and his daughter, who had somehow become a recurring character in her internal life without her consent. The accident had been 4 years ago. She'd been 26. She'd been, at the time, a strategy director at a larger firm, good at her job, moving along the expected trajectory, with the kind of focused ambition that leaves very little room for other people and an awareness that this was a trade-off she was consciously making. She'd been on her way home from a dinner with clients when the other car ran the light. She didn't remember the impact. She remembered the hospital ceiling and the specific quality of silence in that room, and the moment the doctor explained the spinal cord injury with a patience and precision that told her it was not going to be a temporary situation. The next 2 years were the years she did not talk about in interviews and did not include in the version of her story that she shared publicly. Not because they were shameful, there was nothing shameful in them, but because they belonged to her in a way that professional narratives didn't have the right to access. She'd relearned things, she'd grieved things, she'd made decisions about the shape her life would take, and the terms on which she'd inhabit it. She took the CEO role because she'd earned it, and because she was the right person for it, and because she wanted it, not as compensation for what she'd lost, not as proof of anything to anyone, but because running a company was the thing she was genuinely, specifically good at in a way that gave her a functional satisfaction she trusted. What she had not planned for was Noah. She'd seen him on his third day in the hallway, almost running her over with those binders, and she'd clocked the basics quickly. New hire, account team, clearly distracted, coffee in his hand, something slightly tense around his eyes that read as exhaustion rather than incompetence. She'd looked him up in the system that evening out of standard practice. She did this with new hires, especially ones handling major accounts. What she hadn't expected was to find herself looking up again at the end of that first month. Not because of his work, though his work was genuinely good. Because of the way he talked about Ava. He didn't do it often. He was professionally appropriate about it. But when it came up without the self-consciousness that single parents in corporate environments often developed, the preemptive apology for having a child. He mentioned his daughter the way someone mentions a fact about the world. Here is a person who exists. Here is something she said. Here is the situation I am navigating. No performance of guilt. No overcorrection into privacy either. She found it unusual, in a way she did not fully analyze until much later. She moved the Friday meeting. She knew exactly what she was doing and why, and she also knew it sat in a gray area that she was choosing not to look at directly. It was a small accommodation. It was not unusual for a CEO to consider scheduling impacts on her team members' personal situations. She told herself this was true. It was true. It was not the whole truth. The first time Ava came to the office was an accident, in the way that several significant things in Noah's life had been accidents. There was a half day at school in July, some administrative thing he'd put in his calendar correctly, and then forgotten to cross-reference with his Meridian schedule, which meant he arrived at Meridian at 1 in the afternoon with Ava in tow, her backpack still on, an expression of deep interest on her face as the elevator opened onto the second floor. "Whoa," she said. "This is where you work?" "This is where I work." "It's big. It's medium." She looked at him with the expression she used when she believed he was technically correct but missing the point. He'd seen this expression before. It was disturbingly similar to one of his own. He'd intended to set her up at his desk with her library book and his spare headphones and work for 2 hours until Mrs. Paulson could take her. This was the plan. Ava had a different plan, which did not become clear until she saw Evelyn. Evelyn came out of the corridor near the window in conversation with the firm's head of finance, and Ava grabbed Noah's arm and whispered, "Is that her? Is that the Evelyn lady?" Ava, too late. Ava had already raised her hand in a wave that was large enough to be visible from a significant distance. Evelyn noticed, hard not to, and finished her sentence to the finance director and then redirected toward Noah's desk with an expression that was not quite a smile yet, but was clearly heading in that direction. "This must be Ava," she said, stopping a few feet away, which was exactly the right distance, not looming, not detached. Ava, who was normally fairly bold with strangers, went slightly shy. She pressed closer to Noah's arm. "Hi," she said, at about half her usual volume. "Hi, I'm Evelyn." "I know," Ava said. "Daddy talks about you." Noah felt the back of his neck go warm. "I mentioned work," he said. "You said she helps you." "I said my boss helps me manage the schedule." Evelyn looked at him with an expression that was entirely neutral and absolutely, thoroughly amused. "Did he?" she said to Ava. "He said you're professional," Ava said solemnly, "and nice." "That's kind of him." "He said nice second," Ava said, apparently feeling this was an important clarification. Evelyn laughed. Not a polished laugh, a real one, short and caught off guard. And it changed her face in a way Noah wasn't prepared for. It made her look younger, less constructed. She looked at Ava with what he could only describe as actual delight. "Do you want to see the conference room with the big windows?" Evelyn asked. Ava looked at Noah for permission. He said yes before he'd fully decided to, and Ava climbed off her chair immediately, and they went to the conference room, the three of them. And Ava stood at the window and looked out at the city and listed every vehicle she could identify on the street below, with the intense methodical energy of a person conducting official research. Evelyn answered her questions seriously, which was the thing that lodged somewhere in Noah's chest and didn't move. not with the slight condescension of adults who think they're being charming when they talk to children. Seriously, as if Ava's questions deserved serious answers, which they did. They were in there for 20 minutes. When they came back out, Ava told Noah she'd decided the big windows were the best part of the office. Better than the coffee machine? Noah asked. You can see things from windows, Ava said. Coffee is just coffee. Evelyn looked at Noah over the top of Ava's head. Something passed between them, small, unspoken, warm. And then they were back to normal. Ava retrieving her book, Noah at his desk, Evelyn returning to her office. But he noticed, at 4 o'clock, that Evelyn had sent a brief email that simply said, "She's great, Noah." 2 words, a period. He didn't respond until the next morning. He typed, "Yeah, she is." Well, July passed. August arrived hot and slow. The city smelled like asphalt, and someone on his block was growing basil on their fire escape, and he could smell it from the street when the wind was right. Ava started drawing Evelyn. He discovered this without warning on a Wednesday evening when he was flipping through her sketchbook. She'd asked him to find a specific horse she'd drawn 3 weeks ago, and turned a page to find a careful crayon drawing of a woman with dark hair sitting in what was clearly meant to be a wheelchair, though Ava's representation of it was more suggestive than literal. The woman was smiling. There was a window behind her with a city visible in it. He sat with the sketchbook open on his lap for a moment. "Who's this?" he asked, though he knew. Ava looked up from the floor. "Evelyn," she said, as if this were obvious. "When did you draw this?" "Last week. I'm doing a series." He didn't say anything. He found the horse she'd been looking for and handed the sketchbook back. He thought, a series. He thought, this is already complicated. He thought, I don't know how to stop it. The first time Evelyn came to their apartment was in late August, and it was not planned as a significant occasion. Noah had mentioned, in a work conversation, in a context that made sense, that Ava had been asking about the logistics of wheelchair use for reasons he suspected were related to the drawing series. And Evelyn, who was sometimes so direct about things that it bypassed Noah's social processing entirely, had said, "She can ask me." "That's not a requirement," he said immediately. "I know it's not a requirement." "You don't have to." "Noah." She looked at him steadily. "I can come by on Saturday if that works. She can ask her questions and I'll answer them. It's fine." He said Saturday worked. She came on Saturday at 11. Ava met her at the door with a drawn series that was now apparently 7 drawings deep and a focused line of questioning that lasted 45 minutes and included topics like how far the wheelchair could go on one charge, what happened if it rained, and whether Evelyn could feel it if someone pushed the chair from behind, which was a question that surprised Evelyn slightly before she answered it clearly and honestly. Made lunch. Something not impressive. Sandwiches, grapes, the good chips. He watched Evelyn on the living room floor with Ava, both of them going through the drawing series, Evelyn making specific comments about each one, and he felt something he was running out of ways to name. It wasn't gratitude, though it contained gratitude. It wasn't admiration, though it contained that too. It was something more uncomfortable than either of those things. After lunch, Ava had fallen asleep on the couch, the particular crash of a child who has run hard on questions all morning, and Noah and Evelyn had ended up in the kitchen, his kitchen, which was smaller than it needed to be, and had a window that looked at the building across the alley. "You didn't have to do this," he said. "You keep saying that." "Because it's true." She held her coffee cup in both hands and looked at him. "Do I seem like someone who does things I don't want to do?" "No," he admitted. "Then believe me when I say I wanted to come." She glanced toward the living room where Ava was visible on the couch, mouth slightly open. "She's making a series. That's a very specific kind of attention. She does that with things she cares about." Evelyn looked back at him. She didn't say anything for a moment. He was aware of the distance between them in the small kitchen, maybe 4 feet, and the fact that neither of them was moving to increase it. "She asked me," Evelyn said finally, "while you were making lunch, whether you were sad." Noah's chest tightened. "What did you tell her?" "I told her that you didn't look sad to me, that you looked like someone who was working very hard." She paused. She said she knew about the working hard, but she was asking about something different. He was quiet. "She's 6, Evelyn said, not critically, just as an observation about what 6-year-olds can see. "What did you say?" I said I thought you were okay. She looked at him carefully. Are you okay? It was such a simple question. People asked it all the time without expecting an answer. He understood, though, that she was asking it in a way that meant she actually wanted to know. Most days, he said. And the other days? He looked at her. I thought about the long math of it. The bills, the sleepless nights, the Hartwell crises, the treadmill that had to keep running because stopping wasn't an option, and about how he'd spent the last 3 years building a life that was functional and genuinely, meaningfully good in the ways that mattered, and quietly, bone-deep, exhausting in ways that he didn't say out loud. The other days I'm tired, he said, but I'm okay. She nodded. She didn't try to fix it or reframe it. She just received it, which was the thing she did sometimes that undid him slightly. Me too, she said quietly. Most days. He hadn't expected that. He looked at her and she let him look. And there it was again, the window opening just for a second. And he thought about how much was contained in those two words. Her own version of the treadmill, the shape her life had taken, the terms she'd chosen, the things that were good about it, and the things that cost her. Most days. He wanted to say something. He wasn't sure what. The sentence he could feel forming somewhere in him was the kind of sentence that would change the space between them permanently. And the kitchen was small, and Ava was asleep in the next room, and whatever he was feeling was already complicated enough. So he didn't say it. He refilled her coffee. She let him. They stood in his kitchen in the last of the summer afternoon and talked about something else, something easier. And Ava slept on the couch, and the window across the alley caught the light. September brought school back into session, which was in some ways a relief because it restructured the week, and structure was Noah's primary coping mechanism. Ava went back to Ms. Reeves's second-grade class with significant opinions about her seat assignment, which she lobbied for changing with a persistence that Noah found exhausting and also somewhat admirable. The evening conversations with Evelyn were becoming a pattern he hadn't named yet. They didn't plan them. That was the part he kept returning to when he allowed himself to think about it. It wasn't that he was staying late in the hope of seeing her, or at least he was fairly certain that wasn't what was happening. It was that the office was quieter after 7, and quiet made it easier to think. And when Evelyn's office light was still on, which it usually was, he was aware of it in the peripheral way that you become aware of things that your attention has decided are relevant. Sometimes she came out. Sometimes she didn't. When she did, they talked for 15, 20 minutes. Never about anything they planned to talk about. The conversations sprawled in the way conversations do when the people having them are, without quite saying so, relieved to be talking to each other. He told her about his marriage once. Not all of it. Not the shape of what had gone wrong, not the specific grief of watching something you'd believed in simply stop being what you thought it was, but the broad outline. He and Claire had married young, too young probably, both of them operating on blueprints that didn't quite match the people they were actually becoming. She'd left when Ava was 3. She sent cards at birthdays and Christmas. Ava accepted this with a matter-of-factness that he wasn't sure was healthy and hadn't figured out how to address. "Does Ava ask about her?" Evelyn said. "Sometimes. Less now than she used to." He looked at his coffee. "She asked me once if moms could just not want to be moms. I didn't know what to say." "What did you say?" "I said that some people weren't ready for something even when they thought they were, and it didn't mean anything about Ava." He paused. "I don't know if that was the right answer." "I don't think there's a right answer to that question." "No." He looked up. "What did you tell yourself when things happened to you that didn't have a right answer?" She was quiet for a moment. He hadn't planned to ask something that direct, and he wasn't sure she'd take it as an invitation, but she did. She considered it honestly. "I told myself I could be angry about the shape things took, or I could figure out what to do with the shape." She kept her voice even. "I wasted about a year being angry. I'm not saying it was wasted exactly. It was probably necessary. But there came a point where the anger was just weight I was carrying for no reason." She paused. "I don't know if that helps." "It does," he said. She looked at him. "You're not angry." "I was." "What happened to it?" He thought about it seriously. "Ava," he said finally. "Hard to sustain a lot of anger when there's someone who needs your full attention." Evelyn smiled slightly. It was a real smile, the kind she only let out when she wasn't thinking about managing her expressions. He'd learned to recognize it. "That's probably the best reason to have a kid," she said. "Not the intended one." "No, but still." He left the office at 9 that night and walked to his car and sat in it for a moment before starting the engine, thinking about nothing specific, or thinking about everything specific. He couldn't always tell the difference at this hour. The city at 9 was different from the city at 5. Quieter in a way that felt less like peace and more like the city just finally getting tired. He drove home thinking about what she'd said, the anger and the weight of it, the decision to put it down. He thought about her face in the quiet of her office, the particular quality she had when she wasn't being a CEO, when it was just her in a conversation that was only for the two of them. He thought, "I am in serious trouble." He thought, "I have been in serious trouble for a while." He thought, "I don't know what to do about it." He pulled into his parking spot and sat there another minute with the engine off. Then he went upstairs and checked on Ava, still asleep, face turned toward the wall, and brushed his teeth and got into bed and stared at the ceiling for a while in the dark. In 2 floors worth of distance and a half-mile of city street, it was entirely possible that Evelyn Sinclair was also not sleeping. It was also possible she was perfectly fine. She was better than him at containing things. He closed his eyes. He thought about the moment in the kitchen. Most days. He thought about the conference room in May, and the expression on her face before she closed it off, and the fact that they had never talked about it, not once, not even around the edges. He thought, something has to happen, eventually. He thought, I'm not ready. He fell asleep with his window open and the distant sound of the city settling into its own long night. He didn't bring it up on Monday. He'd spent the weekend constructing a version of himself that was professional and grounded and had not spent Friday night staring at the ceiling. And he walked into Meridian on Monday morning carrying that version carefully, the way you carry something that might spill. Evelyn's office light was on when he arrived. The door was closed. He made his coffee, sat down, opened his email, and proceeded to behave like a person who had his life in reasonable order. It worked, mostly, for about 3 days. On Thursday morning, Evelyn stopped by his desk before the 9 o'clock team check-in. This was not unusual. She sometimes did a quick circuit of the floor before meetings, not hovering, just present in a way that told the team she was engaged and paying attention. But she stopped at his desk specifically, and she said, "The Kellerman proposal. I read your draft last night. The framing in the second section is exactly right." And he said thank you, and she nodded, and then she didn't leave immediately, which was slightly unusual. He looked up. She was looking at him with an expression he couldn't categorize. Not the CEO expression, not the after-hours kitchen expression either. Something careful and slightly uncertain, which was not a quality he associated with her. "I've been thinking," she said, at a volume that didn't carry past his desk, "about what you said on Saturday." "I said a lot of things on Saturday." "The part about being tired." She held his gaze. "I just wanted to say, if it gets to a point where it's more than tired, She stopped, seemed to recalibrate. "You can say something." He understood what she meant and what it cost her to say it in those terms. Not an offer of professional support, something more direct than that, dressed in language that kept them both on technically safe ground. "Okay," he said. She nodded. She left for the meeting. He sat there for a moment, aware of his own heartbeat, in a way that was inconvenient at 8:55 on a Thursday morning. He told himself, do not complicate this. He told himself, you have a 6-year-old and an apartment and a job you need, and this woman is your CEO. He told himself all the reasonable things. His heartbeat did not particularly care. October at Meridian was proposal season, which meant 12-hour days for most of the account team, meant a particular kind of low-grade constant pressure that Noah had come to recognize as the occupational atmosphere of the whole month. He ran on black coffee and the knowledge that November would be slower. He picked Ava up later than usual on the hard days and felt the specific guilt of watching her half asleep in Mrs. Paulson's armchair, already in her pajamas. "I'm sorry it's late," he'd say. Mrs. Paulson, who had seen enough in 71 years to be unimpressed by parental guilt, would say, "She had dinner and a bath and a chapter of her book, and she's fine, Noah." He knew Ava was fine. He also knew that fine was not the same as what he wanted for her, and the gap between the two was a thing he carried quietly. Ava, for her part, was developing what he could only call a campaign. It started with the drawings, which had expanded beyond the sketchbook into larger paper that she'd taped to the refrigerator. The series now included a drawing of the three of them at the park, which they had not actually been to together, making it more aspiration than documentation. He looked at it one evening while reheating soup and felt something in his chest do a complicated thing. Then she started asking direct questions. "Do you like Evelyn?" she asked one night at dinner, in the conversational tone she used when she was trying to make something sound casual that was not casual. "She's my boss, Ava." "I know, but do you like her?" "I like working with her." Ava considered this response with visible skepticism. She was 6, but she had inherited whatever quality in him made him see through deflection, which he was beginning to find inconvenient. "She talks about you," Ava said. He set down his fork. "When?" "When she came over. When you were in the kitchen. She said you were one of the hardest workers she knew." Ava delivered this with the satisfaction of someone producing evidence. She said it like it mattered, not like a boss thing. He didn't know what to say to that. He wasn't going to take relationship cues from a 6-year-old, but the accuracy of Ava's social perception had a way of landing in his chest before his brain could intercept it. "Eat your pasta," he said. Ava ate her pasta. She looked at him across the table with the patient expression of someone who believes time is on her side. The evening that changed things fell in the second week of October, a Wednesday, the kind of unremarkable midweek night that doesn't announce itself as significant until you're past it. Noah had stayed late to finish a proposal addendum. The floor was empty by 7:30. He was on his second tee, the good one from the kitchen cabinet that someone had bought for the office, and that nobody seemed to claim ownership of, working through a financial section that required more concentration than he currently had available. He heard Evelyn's office door open at 8:15. She came out into the main floor, which was not her usual pattern at this hour. Usually she left from her office directly, or came to get water, or passed through briefly. Tonight she came and sat in the chair across from his desk, the one clients used when they came in, and she didn't bring anything with her. No coffee, no tablet. She just sat. He looked up. "I'm interrupting," she said. "You're the CEO." "That's not an answer." "No," he said. "You're not interrupting." He pushed the proposal to the side of his monitor. "What's wrong?" She was quiet for a moment. He noticed that she was holding the armrest of her chair in a way that was slightly too deliberate, the way you hold something when you're making sure your hands are still. "I got a call today," she said, "from an executive at Voss Capital. They're putting together a new firm, and they've been talking to a few people they want on the leadership team." She paused. "They want me as CEO." He took a breath. Is that good or bad?" "It's a significant offer." "Evelyn." She looked at him. "Both," she said. "It's both." He waited. "It would mean leaving Meridian." She said this evenly. "Which I built into what it is, which matters to me. And it would mean—" She stopped. Whatever she'd been about to say, she redirected. "It's a complicated decision." He understood what she had stopped herself from saying. He understood it because he felt the specific weight of what was in the gap where those words would have been, and he didn't know what to do with that weight except sit with it. "Do you want to go?" he asked. "I don't know." She looked at the window. "I've been in this office for 6 years, first as strategy director, then as CEO. I know everything about this place. I know how the heat comes on too late in winter and how the third-floor printer jams if you don't let it warm up. I know my team." She paused. "I know what I'd be leaving." She wasn't only talking about the printer and the heating system. He understood that. "What would you be gaining?" he asked. "Scope," she said. "The new firm is larger. The work is more complex. There's a strong board." She looked back at him. "All the rational reasons." "But?" She held his gaze for a moment longer than was comfortable, or longer than they usually permitted, which amounted to the same thing. "I'm still thinking," she said. The conversation moved from there. She asked about the proposal he was working on, and they spent 20 minutes talking through the financial section she'd been involved with from the design stage. And it felt like the conversation they were actually having was running underneath the professional one, like a current beneath river water, present and directional and not visible on the surface. She left at 9. She said goodnight and he said goodnight, and she went back through the glass doors and he sat at his desk for 5 minutes, doing nothing useful, just feeling the shape of the evening settling around him. She hadn't taken the call to talk through a business decision. He was almost certain of that. He also wasn't sure what she had taken the call for, or what it meant that she'd chosen him as the person to sit across from while she figured it out. He was afraid that he did know what it meant, and that knowing it was not going to make anything easier. She didn't mention the Voss Capital offer again. 2 weeks passed. He assumed she'd made a decision he wasn't going to be told about, which was her right and none of his business. And he worked on his proposals and picked up Ava and survived October and told himself things were fine. Then she knocked on his car window on a Thursday evening in the parking structure. He'd been sitting in the car after a long day, too tired to immediately drive, doing the thing he sometimes did where he just sat in the silence of the car for 3 minutes before starting the engine because it was the only 3 minutes of the day that were genuinely his. He heard the knock and startled, and when he turned, he found Evelyn outside the window, her chair alongside the driver's door, a slightly apologetic look on her face. He opened the door, which in the narrow space of the structure was something of an operation. "Sorry," she said. "I saw your car and—" She stopped. "I wanted to say something." "Okay." She looked at him. The parking structure was mostly empty, fluorescent and echoing, a place that existed for transit and wasn't designed for anything that mattered. And she looked at him the way she had in the conference room in May, the window opening, and this time she didn't close it immediately. "I turned down the offer," she said. He was very still. "I've been trying to understand why exactly," she continued, "because the rational case for taking it was strong. And I sat with it for 2 weeks and I couldn't make myself want to go." She paused. "I think I needed to say that to someone." "To someone," he repeated. "To you." She said it directly, in the Evelyn way that didn't decorate things. "I wanted to tell you." He didn't say the thing that was in his chest. "I didn't say it because the parking structure was fluorescent and they were at work, technically, still on work property, and she was still his CEO, and all the things that were true remained true regardless of what was happening in the space between them. He was a person who believed in not acting on things until he knew what he was doing. He had a daughter. He had a job. He had learned, at some cost, that moving too fast towards something you wanted was how you ended up somewhere you hadn't meant to be. "I'm glad," he said. "Yeah?" "Yeah." He looked at her. "I would have missed the conversations." Something shifted in her face. Not the full window, something smaller, just as significant. "Me too," she said quietly. She said goodnight. He said goodnight. He watched her navigate toward the elevator and waited until he couldn't see her anymore. And then he started the car and drove home to Ava and the pasta she'd claimed she wasn't hungry for, and the horse detective book she'd circled back to after finishing the detective series, and he was aware, somewhere below the ordinary business of the evening, that something had changed. Not broken and not resolved. Changed the way a season changes when you're not quite watching, gradually and then suddenly, and you can't go back to what it was before. Well, the morning Ava got sick, he woke up at 4:50 to the sound of her coughing. Not a regular cough. The kind that had texture to it, a wetness that made him sit up immediately, the specific alarm signal that parents develop and cannot turn off. He went to her room and turned on the small lamp by her bed. She was awake, looking at him with the wide-eyed expression of a child who doesn't feel well and has been hoping someone would come. "Daddy," she said. "My chest hurts." He sat on the edge of her bed, put his hand on her forehead. She was warm, not burning. Warm in a way that was concerning rather than immediately dangerous. He listened to her breathe and didn't like what he heard. He took her temperature, 102.3. He called the pediatric clinic when it opened at 7. The nurse asked him a series of questions. She said to bring Ava in at 9. He emailed Meridian at 7:30, a short message to his team lead saying he had a family emergency and would be offline. Then, because he couldn't not, he sent a separate note to Evelyn. He didn't know why he told her specifically. He just sent it, "Ava is sick, taking her to the doctor this morning. Will update when I know more." And put his phone in his pocket and focused on getting his daughter dressed without tiring her out. Evelyn replied before he was out the door. "Don't worry about work. Let me know how she is." He didn't have the space to think about that. He loaded Ava into the car with her blanket and her stuffed rabbit and drove to the clinic. Pneumonia was the word the doctor used at 10:15. Not mild. The cough had developed fast, and the X-ray showed consolidation in the lower right lobe that the doctor described with a calm professionalism that Noah registered through a kind of tunnel, catching every third word and reconstructing the meaning from those. Hospital admission, IV antibiotics, close monitoring. He called Mrs. Paulson from the hospital parking lot to tell her, because Mrs. Paulson cared about Ava and deserved to know, and because he needed to tell someone in a voice that was out loud rather than just in his head. Mrs. Paulson said she'd come to the hospital if he needed her, and he said he'd let her know, and he was grateful, and he couldn't say it with enough weight, so he just said thank you twice. Ava was admitted by noon. They gave her a bed by the window, which she was not well enough to appreciate yet, but which he registered as something good, a window, something to look out of when she felt better. She was attached to monitors and an IV line, and she was so small against the white bed that he had to look somewhere else for a moment to collect himself. He sat beside her bed. He held her hand when she let him, and sat in the chair beside her when she slept. He answered her questions when she had them. What's the drip doing? Does it have to beep? Can we watch something? And handled the nursing check-ins and the physician's evening rounds, and the paperwork that appeared at intervals that seemed designed to prevent any sustained rest. He didn't eat dinner. He forgot until 9 o'clock, at which point it didn't seem worth addressing. The second day was harder than the first in the way that hospital days compound. The sameness of the room, the disrupted sleep of both of them, the small indignities of an institutional environment that is trying its best but is not home. Ava's fever came down 2 degrees and then crept back up. The physician was not alarmed. Noah was controlling what he chose to show on his face. He texted Evelyn at some point on the second afternoon because she'd asked for updates and he was doing his best to give them. He typed, "Fever still up and down. Doctors say this is normal for this stage. She's stable." He looked at what he'd written and then added, "She asked about you today. I told her you said to get better fast." He hadn't told Evelyn to say that. It wasn't true, but Ava had brightened slightly when he said it, and he'd made peace with the small fiction. Evelyn replied, "That's exactly what I said. Tell her I mean it." He read this twice. He put his phone down. He looked at Ava sleeping with the stuffed rabbit under her arm and the monitor light blinking steadily above her bed, and he thought about how fear had a specific texture in his chest, a heaviness that wasn't quite pain, and how the only way he knew to handle it was to just keep sitting with it. He'd been sitting with it for 3 years in various forms. He was getting less good at it, not more. She came on the third night. He didn't know she was coming. He hadn't asked her to come and would not have asked her to come because she was his CEO, and this was a hospital room, and there were already enough complicated things in his life without adding more. It was 12:40 in the morning. Ava was asleep. The night shift nurse had done her 11 o'clock check, and the room was in the particular quiet of a hospital at night. Not silent, never silent, but muffled. Noah was in the chair beside the bed with a cup of terrible vending machine coffee he'd gotten at 11 and not finished, awake in the flat way of someone who has stopped expecting to sleep. He heard the soft sound in the hallway and looked up, and Evelyn came through the doorway. She had a bag on the side of her chair, and she was wearing a coat he'd never seen before, dark gray, practical. She looked at him and then at Ava, and she didn't say anything for a moment. She maneuvered through the narrow hospital room door, which she did without asking for help, and without making it seem like an inconvenience she was managing, just a thing she was doing, and came to the space beside him. She set the bag on the corner of the windowsill. She took out a container of food, something from the Thai place 3 blocks from the office, his order, the one he always got when they ordered in for late meetings, and a coffee from somewhere that was not the hospital vending machine. "Eat," she said, quietly enough not to wake Ava. He looked at the food. He looked at her. "What are you doing here? You haven't mentioned food in 2 days of updates." "I'm fine." "Noah." She looked at him with an expression that did not accept this. "Eat." He ate. He didn't realize how hungry he was until the first few bites, and then he ate with the focused inelegance of someone whose body has been waiting patiently for his brain to catch up. Evelyn sat beside him and didn't talk and didn't make him feel observed while he ate, which was a specific quality of her company he'd come to rely on, the ability to be present without requiring anything from him. The room was quiet except for the monitor. Outside the window, the city did its middle-of-the-night thing. Ava's breathing was even. "She sounds better," Evelyn said, low. Yeah. He looked at Ava. Physician says if the fever stays down tomorrow, she can probably go home the day after. Good. He set the empty container on the windowsill beside the bag. He held the coffee. It was actually warm. She'd gotten it recently. She'd planned the timing of this, and looked at the floor for a moment and then looked at Evelyn. You drove here at midnight, he said. 12:30. Evelyn, I know, she said. I know what it looks like. I'm not... He stopped. He wasn't sure what he'd been about to say. That he wasn't complaining, that he wasn't pushing, that he didn't know what to do with her sitting in his daughter's hospital room at 12:30 in the morning with Thai food and a real coffee. She was looking at Ava in the bed. Her face in the low light of the hospital room was not the CEO face and not the conference room face. It was something quieter and more undefended. She's okay, Evelyn said, still low. She's going to be okay. I know, he said. You've been sitting here for 3 days telling yourself that and not entirely believing it. He didn't answer. He looked at Ava's face, mouth slightly open, rabbit tucked under her arm, the steady blink of the monitor. Yeah, he said. I know. They sat in silence. It was not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that exists between people who have enough between them that silence doesn't need to be filled, and Noah was aware, in the quiet of that room, of how specifically this felt. Not like being alone with someone, but like being with someone. The distinction was not small. An hour passed. Maybe more. He lost track of time in the way that hospital nights erase time, and at some point Ava stirred and he moved his chair closer, and she opened her eyes and looked at him, and then looked past him. Miss Evelyn, she said, foggy with sleep and medication, in a voice that was rough from the cough, but recognizable. You came. I came, Evelyn said simply. Ava looked at her for a moment with the slow consideration of a child who is very tired and filtering everything through exhaustion. Then she looked at Noah. Are you Daddy's girlfriend? She asked. The question arrived the way Ava's questions always arrived, without warning, perfectly aimed, and with the absolute confidence of someone who does not yet know that some questions are supposed to stay unasked. Noah felt the air in the room change. He looked at Evelyn. Evelyn looked at him. Neither of them looked at Ava, who had already closed her eyes again, apparently satisfied with having detonated the question and unbothered about the answer. He didn't say no. He didn't say yes. He sat there in the hospital chair with the coffee warm in his hands and something cracking open quietly in his chest. And across the bed, Evelyn was very still, and the monitor blinked, and the city moved outside the window, and neither of them said a single word. The call from HR came the following morning. Not to Noah first, to Evelyn. He found this out afterward, reconstructing the sequence from what Evelyn told him later, that Sandra Marsh, the head of human resources, had phoned Evelyn's mobile at 8:20 and said, in language that was professionally careful and contained no specific accusation, that there had been a formal inquiry filed by a member of the firm's staff regarding a potential policy concern involving a senior leader and an employee under her direct supervision. Evelyn called Noah at 9:15. He was still at the hospital, at the window, watching the morning arrive in the street below while Ava slept behind him. There's something you need to know, she said. He heard it in her voice before she said anything else. Not panic. Evelyn didn't panic, but something constrained, something she was holding carefully. He turned away from the window and looked at nothing in particular while she explained. Someone had reported her. He didn't know who, not yet. He learned the details in stages over the following hours. The hospital visit, captured on someone's phone, or mentioned to someone who mentioned it to someone else. The schedule accommodations, the coffee she'd brought to his desk, the afternoon his daughter had spent in the office. Individually, any one of those things could be explained. Together, in a formal inquiry, they formed a picture that HR was now obligated to examine. He stood at the hospital window with the phone against his ear and felt a very cold thing move through his chest. How serious is this? He asked. It's a formal inquiry, she said. That means it has a process. Evelyn, how serious? A pause. It depends on how the process goes. He understood what she meant. Depending on how the process went, it could damage her. The CEO, whose position depended on the board's confidence, found to have engaged in what the inquiry would characterize as preferential treatment of an employee. He understood that the inquiry would not be interested in what was actually true about those late nights and the parking structure conversation, and a hospital visit at 12:30 in the morning. It would be interested in what the pattern looked like. The pattern looked like exactly what it was. "I need to come in," he said. "You should stay with Ava. She's stable. She's sleeping. I need to come in, Evelyn." Another pause. "HR wants to speak with both of us. Tomorrow morning." "I'll be there," he said. He put the phone in his pocket. He turned back to the room and looked at his daughter, who was asleep with the rabbit tucked under her arm and the monitor blinking steady above her bed. And he thought about what she'd asked in the gray hours of the night. "Are you Daddy's girlfriend?" Neither of them had answered. He still didn't know what the answer was. He only knew, standing in this hospital room at 9:15 in the morning, that the question had stopped being abstract sometime in the last 72 hours, and that whatever was waiting for them in that HR office tomorrow was going to force the answer into daylight, whether they were ready for it or not. He sat down in the chair beside Ava's bed. He held her hand and he looked at the window and he waited for the morning to keep moving. Ava came home the next morning. The physician signed the discharge paperwork at 9, ran through the follow-up instructions with the careful patience of someone who had given the same instructions many times, and understood that parents in this state retained about 40% of what was said. Noah listened and nodded and wrote the important parts on the back of a receipt he found in his jacket pocket. Oral antibiotics, 10 days. Rest. No school for a week minimum. Watch for the fever returning above 101. He buckled Ava into the back seat with her rabbit and her hospital bracelet, which she wanted to keep, and drove home through a Tuesday morning that was gray and damp and indifferent to everyone in it. Ava fell asleep before they reached the expressway. He drove with the radio off and the heat on low and tried not to think about what was waiting for him tomorrow. Mrs. Paulson came over at noon to sit with Ava while Noah went into the office for the afternoon. He hadn't told Mrs. Paulson about HR. He'd said he had meetings he couldn't move. Mrs. Paulson had looked at him with the particular perception of a woman who had raised 4 children and did not miss much, but she didn't ask, and he was grateful. He went to the office and he sat at his desk, and he did not do especially productive work. He answered emails. He looked at the door to Evelyn's office, which was closed, and stayed at his desk. At 4 o'clock, the door opened. Evelyn came out heading toward the kitchen, and when she passed his desk, she slowed slightly. She didn't stop. She said quietly and without looking directly at him, "She's home?" "She's home," he said. "Sleeping." Evelyn nodded once and kept moving. That was all. But he understood it, the whole shape of it, what it meant that her first question was about Ava and not about tomorrow. And he sat with that understanding for the rest of the afternoon. The HR office was on the 4th floor, in a corner that got good morning light that the rest of the building didn't, which seemed like a design choice that someone had thought would be calming, and which Noah found, walking in at 9 the next morning, mostly just ironic. Sandra Marsh was in her mid-50s, precise without being cold, the kind of person who had spent enough years in HR to have genuine compassion for every person who came through her door, and also a clear-eyed understanding that compassion and process were separate things that had to be handled separately. She had a yellow legal pad and 2 pens, and a glass of water that she didn't touch. Evelyn was already there when Noah arrived. She was at the table, her posture, the CEO posture, composed and direct. Noah sat down across from Sandra. Evelyn was to his left. The room was small enough that he was aware of the distance between them as a specific, measured thing. Sandra explained the inquiry process in a tone that was professional without being intimidating. A formal concern had been filed. The concern alleged that Evelyn, in her capacity as Noah's direct supervisor, had extended a pattern of preferential treatment that went beyond the scope of professional conduct and suggested a personal relationship that created an unequal dynamic in the workplace. The firm's policy on supervisory relationships was clear. A direct reporting relationship between individuals engaged in a personal relationship was a structural conflict requiring intervention. The inquiry was not a verdict. It was a process. Noah listened. He kept his hands flat on the table and his face even. Sandra asked Evelyn to respond to the specific items: the schedule modifications, the remote work approvals, the hospital visit. Evelyn answered each one without deflecting. The schedule modifications were documented and within her discretionary authority as CEO. The remote work approvals were consistent with what she extended to other team members in comparable situations. She named 2 other employees and their situations specifically. The hospital visit was a personal choice she made as an individual and not in her capacity as Noah's supervisor. She was precise. She was honest. She did not attempt to make the hospital visit sound like something it wasn't. Sandra made notes. She asked Noah to speak to his understanding of the accommodations he'd received and whether he believed they had come with any implicit expectations regarding his performance or conduct. No, Noah said. Never. Did you feel that the accommodations created a professional obligation to Ms. Sinclair beyond your standard employment responsibilities? No. Were you aware of any personal dimension to Ms. Sinclair's interest in your situation at the time the accommodations were made? He thought about this one. He thought about the Friday meeting time, and the email about Ava's ear infection, and the coffee at 9:20 at night, and all the slow accumulation of things that had happened between then and the hospital room. I understood that she was a thorough manager, he said. I became aware that it was something more than that over time, not immediately. Sandra looked at him. And when you became aware of that, did you take any steps to address it through official channels? No, he said. Why not? He held Sandra's gaze and said the true thing, because there wasn't a point in anything else. Because I didn't want to. Silence. Sandra wrote something on her pad. She asked a few more questions, clarifying, procedural, and then she said she needed to step out briefly and would be back. The door clicked shut behind her. Noah looked at the table. Evelyn looked at the window. You didn't have to say that, she said. It was true. I know it was true. I'm saying you didn't have to say it here. Sandra's been doing this job for 20 years, he said. She would have known I was lying. Evelyn was quiet for a moment. The board is going to be notified. I know. This is going to affect my position. I know that too. He looked at her. I'm sorry. She turned to look at him, and there was something sharp in it. Don't apologize for this. Evelyn, don't. Her voice was controlled and also, underneath the control, something rawer than he'd heard from her before. This is not something you did to me. Don't make it that. He didn't say anything. She looked at the window again, and he watched the side of her face. The specific tension in her jaw, the way she was holding herself together by the particular method she'd developed over years of holding herself together in rooms where coming apart was not an option. I should have handled it differently, she said. From the beginning. I knew what I was doing and I kept doing it anyway, and now you're sitting in this room. I'm sitting in this room because I wanted to be here, he said, in all the versions of this situation. She didn't respond. The words sat between them. He hadn't planned to say them, and he wasn't sorry he had. Sandra came back. She sat down and told them that given the nature of the relationship and the specific reporting structure, the firm's policy required a structural separation. Evelyn would need to be removed from Noah's direct supervisory chain. Given Evelyn's position as CEO, the practical options were limited. She could take a formal leave while the account team structure was reorganized, or she could voluntarily recuse herself from any involvement in Noah's accounts and evaluations pending a board review. A third option, and Sandra said this carefully, without editorializing, was that one of the parties involved could remove themselves from the situation voluntarily. The room was quiet for a moment. Then Evelyn said, I'll step down from direct supervision of Noah's accounts, effective immediately. I'll recuse myself from his performance evaluations and any budgetary decisions affecting his position, and I'll document that recusal formally. Sandra looked at her. That would require board approval of the interim structure. I'll speak to the board this afternoon. Evelyn's voice was even. I'll take full responsibility for the situation in that conversation. Ms. Sinclair, Sandra paused. I want to be clear. The inquiry doesn't require you to accept fault. It requires a structural solution. I understand that, Evelyn said. This is my choice. Sandra nodded slowly. She wrote something. She said she'd prepare the interim documentation and that both of them should plan to be available for follow-up questions. She thanked them for coming in. She said she was sorry for the difficulty of the situation, and she sounded like she meant it. They left the HR office together and went to the elevator in silence. The elevator took a while to arrive, the way it always did. They stood in the hallway with a professional 2 feet between them and waited. You didn't have to do that, Noah said. Don't, she said. Accept full responsibility in front of the board. Noah. She looked at him directly. I am fully responsible. That's not a performance. I made choices knowing what they were. The elevator opened. They got in. The doors closed. What does this do to you with the board? He asked. I don't know yet. But it could be significant. Yes. He looked at the numbers above the door. Second floor, third floor. This is because of me. This is because of both of us. She said it without softening it and without any blame in it either. Just a fact about two people in the situation they'd built together without quite planning to. I'd rather be honest about that. The elevator reached the second floor. The doors opened. She moved through them and he followed, and they walked back to the main floor in the particular silence of people who have said things that will need more time to fully land. He knew what he was going to do before he sat down. He'd known it somewhere around the fourth floor, in the elevator, watching the numbers. He wasn't sure if it was the right thing. He genuinely wasn't. But he knew with the specific certainty of someone who has finally reached the bottom of a situation that it was the only thing he was capable of doing. He went to his desk. He opened a blank document. He wrote 4 sentences. He read them twice. He printed them, signed them, and walked to Sandra Marsh's office on the 4th floor. Sandra looked up when he came in. I'm resigning, he said. He put the page on her desk. Effective 2 weeks from today, or immediately if that's cleaner for the process. Sandra looked at the page. She looked at him. Mr. Carter, the inquiry does not require. I know what the inquiry requires, he said. This isn't about the inquiry. She was quiet for a moment. Does Ms. Sinclair know you're doing this? No? You should tell her. I'm going to. He looked at Sandra steadily. I want to be clear that this is voluntary and that there was no coercion in any direction. I'd appreciate if that was part of the documentation. Sandra said it would be. She looked at the resignation letter again. I'm sorry, she said. For what it's worth. Thank you, he said. He went back downstairs. Evelyn's office door was open when he got back to the floor, which was unusual for that time of day. He could see her at her desk, on the phone, her back partially to the door. He waited at his desk. He didn't know how to start the conversation, and he wasn't sure when he'd get the chance, and in the meantime, he had a pharmaceutical client with a 3 o'clock call that he had to prepare for regardless of everything else. He prepared for it. He took it at 3. He handled it with the composed competence he'd developed over a year at this company. The part of him that knew how to be professional even when the rest of him was doing something more complicated. At 4:30, Evelyn's door was closed again. At 5, most of the team began filtering out. At 5:40, he knocked on her door. Come in, she said. He came in. She was at her desk with 2 documents open on her monitor, and she looked at him with the alert expression of someone who reads the situation in the first second. What did you do? She said. I resigned. The room was very still. You... She stopped. She put down the pen she'd been holding. Noah. It makes the process cleaner, he said. The inquiry closes more easily. Your board conversation is simpler, and you don't have to restructure supervision and recuse yourself from account decisions and all the rest of it. I told Sandra I would handle. I know what you told her. He sat down in the chair across from her desk, the client chair, which felt right somehow, on that side of the desk, not pretending to be something other than what the situation required. That's why I did it before you could talk me out of it. She looked at him. He'd expected anger, or the controlled version of it that she used when she was managing something sharp. What he got instead was something quieter, which was somehow harder to sit with. You have Ava, she said. You have a mortgage and medical bills, and you can't just, I can get another job. He said this with more confidence than he felt, because the confidence was necessary for this moment, even if it wasn't entirely earned. I'm good at what I do. I have the Hartwell renewal on my record. I'll find something. That's not a plan. That's an intention. I know the difference. I'm working on the plan. She looked at him for a long moment. The evening light came through the window behind her, the glass and steel view of the city she'd looked at from this office for 6 years, and he thought about her turning down Voss Capital in the parking structure, the way she'd said, I wanted to tell you, and the specific quality of that moment and how it connected to this one. Why? She said. It wasn't an accusation. It was a real question. She wanted to know what he would say. Because you built this, he said. This company, this office, this position. You built it under circumstances that were genuinely hard, and you didn't talk about that in interviews, and you didn't make it the centerpiece of your identity. You just did the work. And I'm not going to be the reason the board starts having difficult conversations about your judgment." He looked at her. "You accepted full responsibility in that room this morning, for both of us. I'm not going to let that be the end of the story." She was very still. "I'm also," he said, "a 32-year-old man who is aware that whatever this is between us is not going to survive me staying here. Not the way it is now. One of us was always going to have to change the situation. I'd rather it be me." The silence lasted long enough that he could hear the building, the particular settling sounds of an office at the end of the day, the elevator somewhere, the HVAC system, the distant city. "You're the best person I've had in this department," she said. Her voice was even and also not entirely even. "In 6 years." "You'll find someone," he said. "That's not what I—" She stopped. She pressed her lips together, looked at the window. "That's not the point." "I know it's not the point." She looked back at him. He could see the effort it took her to keep the CEO face in place, and he also saw the places where it wasn't quite holding, the slight tension at the corners of her eyes, the way she was holding her hands too carefully on the desk. "I don't want you to go," she said. "Just that. No dressing on it." "I know," he said. "I'm going anyway." He stood. He was going to hold it together for this part because she needed him to, and because the alternative was a conversation he didn't trust himself to navigate in this office on this evening. He picked up his jacket from the back of the chair. "The Kellerman account," he said. "The transition documentation is on the shared drive. I'll finish it by end of week. Davis on my team knows the client well enough to take it over cleanly." She didn't say anything. "I'll be in touch," he said. "About the rest of the transition." She nodded. "Once. Precise." He walked to the door. He stopped there for a moment with his hand on the frame, not turning around, just standing in the threshold of an office he'd come to know well over the course of a year. The particular light at this time of day, the view of the city he could see from the edge of the doorway, the sound of her breathing in the silence behind him. "Evelyn," he said. "Yeah. Thank you." He meant the Friday meeting time and the coffee at 9:20 and the ear infection follow-up and the hospital at 12:30, and all of it. The whole accumulation of small, careful acts that had been adding up to something for months. For all of it. She said nothing for a moment, then quietly, "Go home to your daughter, Noah." He went. The next 2 weeks were the particular grind of an exit managed carefully. He briefed his accounts, completed his documentation, answered transition questions from Davis and 2 other team members who would be absorbing his workload. He was professional and thorough because that was who he was, and because he owed that to the people he was leaving the work with, none of whom were responsible for the situation. He did not have significant private conversations with Evelyn during those 2 weeks. He saw her, the office was not that large, and they interacted where the work required it, and she was professional and he was professional, and neither of them made it harder than it had to be. He understood this was costing her something. He suspected she knew it was costing him too. Ava, recovered and back at school, asked about Evelyn twice. He told her that Daddy was changing jobs and that things at the office were shifting. Ava received this with a focused silence that meant she was processing, and then asked if they would still see Evelyn. "I think so," he said. "In a different way." "What does different mean?" "It means not the same as before, but not gone either." Ava thought about this. "Okay," she said, in the tone she used when she'd decided to trust him. He held on to that. He told Mrs. Paulson he was between jobs, which was true, and that he had some leads, which was partially true. He had made 3 calls in the second week of his notice period. One to a former colleague now at a different firm, one to a client contact who'd mentioned openings in a passing conversation months ago, one to a recruiter he'd worked with before. He was building the plan he'd promised Evelyn he had. He didn't know if it would work fast enough. He did the math on his savings and tried not to look at it too directly. His last day at Meridian was a Thursday. He brought in a box at lunch, which seemed less dramatic than bringing one in the morning, and packed it quickly while most of the team was away from their desks. The dinosaur sippy cup was not in the box, because he'd stopped bringing it to work approximately 11 months ago when he'd finally replaced his travel mug. But he thought about it briefly while packing, and the thought was not unhappy. Several colleagues came by in the afternoon to say goodbye, and he meant what he said to each of them, because they were good people, and he'd worked alongside them for a year, and that was real, regardless of how it had ended. Davis told him the Kellerman client had asked about him, which Noah took as a professional compliment and a small comfort. At 4 o'clock, he picked up the box and looked at his desk once, the clear surface of it, anonymous again. He walked past Evelyn's office. The door was closed. The light was on. He stood there for about 4 seconds. He did not knock. He went to the elevator. He went down to the lobby. He walked out of Meridian Group with his box under his arm into a Thursday afternoon that was cold and clear, with the particular quality of autumn light that makes everything look slightly more vivid than it actually is. And he stood on the sidewalk for a moment before walking to his car. He drove home. He picked up Ava from Mrs. Paulson's. He made pasta, the kind she liked with the butter and the parmesan rather than the sauce, because it was a pasta and butter night if there ever was one. Ava told him about something that had happened at recess involving a disagreement over rules that she had strong opinions about, and he listened and asked the right questions and held the whole ordinary shape of the evening together, the way he always did. After she was asleep, he sat in the kitchen with the light on and his phone on the table and thought about what came next. The silence of the apartment at that hour was the particular silence of a life that was his, specifically, imperfectly, entirely his. And he sat in it and let himself feel the full weight of the last several weeks without trying to compress it into something more manageable. He was unemployed. His savings had a runway that was real but not generous. He had 3 leads that might become something and might not. He had a daughter sleeping in the next room who'd asked if they would still see Evelyn, and he'd said he thought so, in a different way, and he needed that to be true. He picked up his phone. He looked at it for a long moment. He put it down. He did not text Evelyn. He understood, in the way you understand things when you've finally gotten honest with yourself, that he was in love with her, not in the half-aware way of the last several months, not in the way he'd been declining to name it, but fully and without the cover of professional circumstance to make it complicated. He'd known it in the hospital room. He'd known it in the elevator. He'd known it standing in the threshold of her office, saying thank you for all of it. What he didn't know was whether that was something that had a future outside the space where it had grown, or whether it was one of those feelings that existed precisely because of the constraints around it, and would turn out to be different in the open air. He needed to find out. He was also a person who'd just resigned his job, and the immediate priority was Ava and the rent and the 3 leads he was converting into a plan. Love was real. Love was also not the only thing that was real. He turned off the kitchen light. He stood in the dark apartment and listened to the city outside and to Ava breathing in her room, and he thought, okay, one thing at a time. What he did not know, what was already moving, quietly and without his knowledge, through a series of phone calls and professional connections that Evelyn Sinclair had been making since the morning after he handed Sandra his resignation, was that one of those 3 leads was not entirely a coincidence. He didn't know that yet. He would find out later, in a way that would cost him something and give him something back in the same moment. But that evening, in his kitchen, in the dark, he just stood there and breathed, and that was enough for now. The first week after Meridian was the hardest, and not for the reasons he'd expected. He'd braced for the financial anxiety, which was real but manageable. His savings held, the math was tight but not yet dangerous, and he had enough professional discipline to work the 3 leads without the desperation that makes people interview badly. He'd braced for the loss of structure, which he addressed by building a new one. Up at 6:30 with Ava, school drop-off at 8, job search from 8:30 to noon. Lunch, 2 hours of follow-up and networking, school pickup at 3. He filled the shape of the day deliberately because an unfilled day at this particular moment was not something he trusted himself inside of. What he hadn't braced for was the quiet. Not Ava's quiet. She was not a quiet child, and the evenings were as full as they'd always been, her voice filling the apartment with running commentary on everything from school politics to the structural implausibilities of the horse detective book she'd returned to. He meant the quiet of the work hours. The absence of a specific kind of engagement that he understood. Now that it was gone, he'd been depending on more than he'd known. Not just the work itself, the specific texture of that office. The particular pull of Evelyn's closed door, the knowledge that she was on the other side of it, the late evenings when the floor emptied out, and the conversations happened that he now had nowhere to put. He didn't contact her. He'd made a decision, somewhere in the kitchen, in the dark, on his last night of employment, that he was going to give this space. He didn't know how much space. He knew that calling her the week he resigned was the wrong move, too raw, too immediate, too likely to turn into a conversation driven by the situation rather than by what he actually needed to say. So he waited. He worked his leads. He made Ava's lunches and walked her to school and listened to her talk about the horse detective. And at night he sat in the kitchen with his coffee and his honest accounting of where things stood and tried to be patient with himself. He was not naturally patient. He was learning it the slow way, which was the only way it actually took. The call from Hargrove and Associates came on a Wednesday, 11 days after his last day at Meridian. He almost didn't answer. The number wasn't in his contacts, and he'd been getting recruitment calls all week from firms that had scraped his LinkedIn profile, most of which were for positions that didn't fit. He answered on the fourth ring mostly because he was between tasks and had nothing to lose. The woman on the other end introduced herself as Patricia Vance, Director of Client Strategy at Hargrove and Associates. She said they were looking to build out their senior account team with someone who had experience managing complex corporate communications under pressure, and that his name had come up in conversation with someone whose professional judgment she trusted considerably. "Can I ask who referred me?" he said. A brief pause. "Evelyn Sinclair," Patricia said. "We were colleagues about 5 years ago. She called me last week." He sat very still at his kitchen table. Patricia continued. The role was Senior Account Manager, which was a step above where he'd been at Meridian. The client portfolio was strong, 3 anchor clients with long tenure, 2 newer ones with growth potential. The hours were structured, and the firm had an explicit policy around work-life balance that she described with the specific candor of someone who wanted to be accurate rather than just appealing. The compensation was better than what he'd been making. He said he was interested. He said he'd like to come in and talk. He hung up and sat at his kitchen table and looked at the wall for approximately 3 minutes. She had called. She had called Patricia Vance at Hargrove and Associates last week, which meant within days of his resignation, maybe the day after, maybe the same evening he'd driven home and made pasta and put Ava to bed, and had given him a referral that came with whatever weight Evelyn Sinclair's name carried in this industry, which was considerable. She had done this without telling him, without making it something he had to receive with gratitude or respond to or manage. She had simply done it, the way she did things, quietly, without performance, without requiring acknowledgement. He thought about the late evenings and the coffee at 9:20 and the Friday meeting time. He thought about all of it, and most days and the parking structure, the Thai food at the hospital, 12:30 in the morning. He thought about her sitting in that HR office accepting full responsibility in a clear, precise voice while he sat beside her and said the true thing because there wasn't a point in anything else. He thought, "I am not going to wait much longer." He thought, but not yet. The interview at Hargrove was on a Friday. He wore the good suit and came early and answered every question the way he always answered questions in rooms like this, directly, with examples, without overselling. Patricia Vance was sharp and practical and asked him things that required actual thought, which he appreciated. The team he met was small and seemed reasonably functional, which in his experience was not guaranteed. On the subway home, he thought about Evelyn in her office on his last day. The door closed, the light on. 4 seconds on the threshold. He had not knocked. He wondered if he should have. Patricia called Monday morning. The offer came Tuesday by email. He read it twice, forwarded nothing to anyone, and accepted on Wednesday. He texted Mrs. Paulson that he had good news. Mrs. Paulson replied with a photograph of Ava, apparently taken that afternoon, wearing Mrs. Paulson's reading glasses and holding a book upside down with great dignity. He looked at the photograph for a long time. He started at Hargrove in 2 weeks. That evening, after Ava was asleep, he sat at the kitchen table and opened a text message to Evelyn. He'd written nothing on it yet. He sat there with the blank message open and thought about what he wanted to say, and rejected several things, and finally typed, "I got the job at Hargrove. I know what you did. Thank you." He stared at it. He deleted, "I know what you did." He deleted, "Thank you." He sat with just, "I got the job at Hargrove" for about 30 seconds, and then deleted that too. He closed the phone. The things he wanted to say to her were not text message things. He understood that now. They were the kind of things that required a room and two people in it and enough time to say them without cutting anything important short. He went to bed. He slept better than he had in 3 weeks. He called her on a Saturday, 12 days after he'd accepted the Hargrove offer. He'd started the new job the previous Monday, and it was going well. Different cadence than Meridian, smaller team, clients who were complicated in new ways that he was starting to map. He liked it. More than he'd expected to in the first week, which he took as a decent sign. The hours were what they'd promised, which meant he picked Ava up himself every day, and this was a change that she received with the particular enthusiasm of someone who had been too polite to previously say that she preferred it. He called Evelyn at 10 in the morning, when he knew from the schedule she'd kept for years that she'd be between her early work and the midday obligations she usually reserved for external calls. He didn't know if she still kept that schedule. He was betting on it. She answered on the second ring. "Noah," she said. Just his name, neutral, careful. "Hi," he said. A beat. "Hi." He was standing at the kitchen counter with a coffee he wasn't drinking. Outside, Ava was in the building's shared courtyard with Mrs. Paulson's granddaughter, a Saturday morning arrangement that gave him approximately 90 minutes. "I started at Hargrove last Monday," he said. "How is it?" "Good, actually. Really good." He paused. "Patricia told me you called her." Silence. "You should have told me," he said. I know you would have told me not to," she said. "Yeah. That's why I didn't tell you." He smiled despite himself, looking at the kitchen wall. That was so specifically her. The complete, unapologetic logic of it. "Thank you," he said. "Not just for Hargrove, for all of it." He stopped. "I said that when I left, but I don't think I said it right. I meant the whole year. The way you ran the department, the way you—" He stopped again, because the next part was harder, and he'd promised himself he'd say it. "The way you paid attention, to me and to Ava. Nobody's done that in a long time. I wanted you to know that it mattered." The silence on her end was not empty. He could hear her breathing, which told him she was there, and still, and listening. "I'm glad," she said finally. Her voice had something in it that wasn't the CEO voice and wasn't the evening office voice either, something more open than both. "I'd like to see you," he said. "Not for I'm not calling to fix anything or manage anything. I just want to see you, properly, outside of work. If that's something you want." The pause lasted long enough that he started to prepare himself for a version of no. Not a cruel version. Evelyn was not capable of cruel. But a careful, honest version that would explain why the situation still didn't allow it, why the gap between them was still complicated, why she needed more time or more distance. "Saturday," she said. "Next Saturday. There's a farmer's market near the waterfront. Ava would probably have opinions about it." He exhaled slowly. "She has opinions about everything." "I know." And there it was. The real laugh, the caught-off-guard one. "Is 10 too early?" "10 is perfect," he said. "Okay," she said. "Okay," he said. He hung up and stood at the kitchen counter and drank his coffee, which had gone slightly cold, and it was the best coffee he'd had in 3 weeks. The farmer's market was crowded in the good way, the way that meant it was actually functioning rather than performing. It ran along the waterfront for 4 or 5 blocks, produce and bread, and a woman selling plants that Ava immediately wanted all of. A man with a stand of handmade wooden toys that she examined with the seriousness of someone conducting a quality assessment. Evelyn moved through the crowd with the particular efficiency she brought to physical spaces. Not aggressive, not apologetic, just present and practical in a way that anticipated what the space required. He'd noticed this before, the complete absence of self-consciousness about it, and he noticed it again now between the vegetable stands and the bread table. Ava had attached herself to Evelyn's left side within approximately 8 minutes of their arrival. Not to his left side, to Evelyn's. She had taken it upon herself to provide a running commentary on everything they passed, including opinions on which vegetables looked good and which did not. A framework that seemed to be based on a personal aesthetic theory she had not previously disclosed. "That one's too lumpy," she told Evelyn, gesturing at a butternut squash with the confidence of an expert. "What's wrong with lumpy?" Evelyn asked. "It means it's confused." Evelyn looked at him. He looked back. She looked like she was working very hard to maintain a straight face and not quite managing. Does a vegetable need to know what shape it is? Evelyn asked Ava. Ava considered this seriously. Probably yes, she said, for confidence. They walked the length of the market and doubled back, and Noah bought bread and apples and let Ava buy a small painted wooden bird from the toy stand. And at some point between the bread table and the coffee stand at the far end, he found that Evelyn and Ava were a few paces ahead of him, and Ava was saying something that required her to use both hands to illustrate, and Evelyn was listening with the specific attention she gave things that mattered to her, and he stopped walking for just a second and looked at them. He thought about what Ava had asked in the hospital room at 2 in the morning. Are you Daddy's girlfriend? The undetonated honesty of a 6-year-old aimed straight at the thing neither adult had been saying. He thought about the drawing on the refrigerator. The aspiration, not the documentation. 3 people at a park. A father, a little girl, a woman in a wheelchair. He started walking again. They got coffee. Tea for Evelyn, coffee for Noah, hot chocolate for Ava, who negotiated this with great seriousness, and found a bench along the waterfront that was wide enough for all 3 of them if Evelyn's chair was angled right. Ava sat between them with her hot chocolate and her wooden bird, naming the bird with a deliberateness that suggested the name was being selected from a very competitive shortlist. Gerald, she announced. Noah looked at the bird. It was small and orange. Gerald, he said. He has a serious face, Ava explained, so he needs a serious name. That's solid logic, Evelyn said. I know, Ava said. She held Gerald up and showed him the waterfront, apparently for orientation purposes, and then tucked him into her coat pocket. He can see from there, she explained to no one in particular. The waterfront was cold in the bright way of late autumn, the kind of cold that's easier to be in than it looks from inside. The water was gray-blue and the far shore was visible, and there were 2 boats moving across the middle distance that Ava tracked until they went past. Noah and Evelyn talked, in the way they'd always talked when Ava was occupied, easily, about real things, without the ambient tension of the professional context they'd been navigating for a year. She told him about the board meeting that had followed the inquiry, which had been difficult in the way she'd predicted and then resolved in a way she hadn't, with the board ultimately supporting her decision to restructure supervision and noting in the official documentation that her handling of the process had been transparent and appropriate. They're not wrong, he said. I know they're not wrong. It was still uncomfortable. Did anyone on the board make it harder than it needed to be? One person. She didn't elaborate and he didn't push. It passed. And your position? She looked at the water. Intact? Questioned, briefly. Intact. She paused. I had to have 3 separate conversations in the following 2 weeks with different board members who all wanted to assess, in their own individual ways, whether I was all right. Were you? She looked at him. I was handling it. That's not the same thing. No, she said. It's not. A beat. I was not entirely all right. I missed the conversations. He nodded. He'd known this in the way you know things about people you've been paying close attention to for a year, which is to say, he'd known it without being told. Me too, he said. Ava, who had been attending to the boats with her full focus, turned around and looked at both of them with the alert expression of someone who has caught the frequency of a conversation even without the specific words. Are you talking about feelings? She asked. We're talking about work, Noah said. Ava looked at him with the skeptical expression. She looked at Evelyn. Was it feelings? Evelyn, to her credit, considered the question with genuine respect. A little bit, she said. Ava nodded, satisfied. She turned back to the water. Noah looked at Evelyn. Evelyn looked at Noah. He thought, all right, now. I need to say something, he said, and I've been thinking about how to say it for about 3 weeks, and I still don't have a clean version of it, so I'm just going to say the real version. She turned toward him slightly. Her hands were in her lap, still, the way they got when she was giving something her full attention. I'm in love with you, he said, not in the complicated professional context way, not in the I don't know what this is way. I've known what it is for a while now, and I've been waiting until the situation was different enough that saying it wouldn't make things worse. He looked at her steadily. The situation is different now. I don't have a case to make because it's not an argument, it's just true. I love you. And I wanted to say it outside of an office and not in a parking structure and not in a hospital room at midnight. because you deserve to hear it in an actual normal situation like a farmer's market on a Saturday morning. The waterfront moved around them. The boats, and the cold air, and the distant noise of the market, and Ava beside him, very still, who was almost certainly not thinking about boats anymore. Evelyn didn't look away from him. She didn't do the thing she sometimes did, closing the window, pulling the professional composure back into place. She just looked at him, and for once, all of it was visible, not broken open the way it had been in unguarded moments, but openly present, chosen, deliberate. "I know," she said. "I've known for a while." And I love you," she said. Like it was simple, like it was the thing she'd been holding in her hands for months, waiting for the right moment to set down. "I think I started falling for you somewhere around the time you told me you were tired on the other days. And I spent a long time telling myself it was the situation, that it was the proximity, that it was—" She stopped. "It wasn't the situation. It was you." He reached across the bench and took her hand, the right one, which was resting on the armrest of the chair between them. Her hand turned over and closed around his, and it was not dramatic. It was the quietest thing. Two hands in the cold morning air beside a waterfront, and it felt like the most natural thing that had happened to him in years. Ava, who had been performing her disinterest in the boats with gradually decreasing conviction, turned around. She looked at their hands. She looked at Evelyn. She looked at Noah. "So she is your girlfriend," she said. Noah said, "We're working on it." Ava appeared to consider whether this was an acceptable answer. "Okay," she said, "but Gerald thinks you should just say yes." She produced the wooden bird from her pocket and held it up briefly as supporting evidence, then put it away. Evelyn laughed, the real laugh, the one that changed her whole face, and Noah laughed, and Ava looked pleased with herself in the way she did when an argument had landed and the waterfront continued on around them, indifferent and bright. Things did not become simple after that. They were not the kind of people things became simple for, and they both understood this without needing to say it. What they built, in the months that followed, was slower and less cinematic than the year that had come before it. The tension of the impossible situation was gone, and what replaced it was something that required different work. The ordinary, unglamorous work of two people learning each other outside the charged context where they'd first done it. There were things that took adjustment. Evelyn had built a life around a particular kind of self-sufficiency that was not selfishness, but was sometimes hard to make space around. She'd learned, over 4 years of navigating the world in a wheelchair and 6 years of running a company, to anticipate everything herself, to need nothing from anyone that she hadn't already arranged to provide herself. This was a survival strategy that had served her extraordinarily well, and also made intimacy feel, at first, like a room she'd forgotten the layout of. She told him this on a night in December, in his kitchen, at the table where he did most of his honest thinking. She said it plainly, which was her way. "I'm not good at letting people in. I know what it looks like from the outside because I'm observant, but doing it myself is different." "I know," he said. "It might be slow. I'm not going anywhere." She looked at him. "You keep saying that. It keeps being true." She was quiet for a moment, then, "Okay." Just that. The way she said things she meant. He had his own adjustments to make. He understood with the clarity that comes from a year of examining yourself honestly, still carrying some of the protective distance he'd built during the years after Claire left. The specific way he'd learned to keep the real interior of his life behind the competent exterior, to be present and warm and still guarded in the places that could actually be hurt. He'd let Evelyn see more of that interior than he'd let most people see. And now that the situation was openly what it was, he had to get used to letting her see it without the structure of circumstance around it. It was harder than he'd expected. It was also, gradually, easier. Ava accelerated both of these processes by being completely without subtlety about it. She had decided, with the efficiency of a 6-year-old who had already been planning this outcome for some time, that Evelyn was a permanent feature of the household, and she acted accordingly. She showed Evelyn where things were in the apartment. She told Evelyn her opinions about everything. She brought the drawing series out of the sketchbook and presented it formally, one drawing at a time, with explanatory commentary. Evelyn received all of this with the specific seriousness she'd always given Ava's questions and productions, not performing attention, giving it. She came to the apartment on weekends sometimes. She sat on the living room floor with Ava and the horse detective books. She told Ava, at some point that Noah was not present for and only learned about later, that the wheelchair was just a different way of getting places, and that different was not the same as less. Ava had apparently thought about this for 2 days and then informed Noah at breakfast. Evelyn says different isn't less. I think that's true for a lot of things. I think you're right, he said. Like how Gerald doesn't look like a normal bird, she said, but he's still good. Gerald is an excellent bird. Yeah. She ate her cereal. I told Evelyn that. She agreed. He had a vision, briefly, of the two of them comparing notes about him, and decided that whatever they were saying was probably more accurate than anything he would have chosen to present about himself, and that this was fine. In February, Evelyn told him about the accident for the first time. Not the facts of it. He'd known the rough shape for years, the same shape anyone with internet access could find. She told him what it had been like. The 2 years she never talked about publicly. The specific grief of it, which was not what people who described her story as inspiring assumed it was. Not grief for the walking, not primarily, but grief for the version of her future she'd imagined without ever examining it, and the disorienting work of building a new imagination for a life whose shape had permanently changed. She told him this in the evening, at his kitchen table, in the low light that made the kitchen feel like the kind of place things could be said. She told it plainly and without the performance of difficulty, just the facts of what she'd felt and what she'd done with it. And he listened without trying to reframe it or fix it or tell her she was stronger for it, because that wasn't what she was offering it for. When she'd finished, she looked at him in the way she did when she wanted to know what he was actually thinking. I'm glad you told me, he said. You're not going to say anything about resilience? No. Good. She looked at the table for a moment. I wanted you to know it, not the version people publish about me. The actual version. I know the difference, he said. Yeah, she said. You do. He reached across the table. She took his hand. There is a thing about love that nobody tells you adequately in advance, which is that the version of it that lasts isn't the high-tension version. The loaded glances and the things unsaid and the suspended moment in a conference room where someone says something impulsive and the air changes. That version is real. It's the version that gets your attention. But what it turns into, if you're willing to do the actual work, is something less cinematic and considerably more valuable. The ordinary weight of two people choosing, day after day, to keep showing each other the real interior of themselves. To not retreat behind the competent exterior when it gets hard. To take the hand across the table in the low kitchen light and mean it. Noah Carter had spent 3 years building a life from practical necessity, filling every hour because empty hours were dangerous, making himself into someone reliable and capable and fine, which he was. But fine was not the whole story. He'd been lonely in the specific way of people who are too busy to acknowledge their loneliness, which doesn't make it smaller, just quieter. He hadn't planned for Evelyn Sinclair. She'd happened to him the way the best things happen, incrementally, without announcement, through 100 small moments that were each unremarkable on their own and entirely transformative in accumulation. Spring came in the gradual way it does in that part of the country, reluctant and then sudden. Ava had moved on from the horse detective books and into a series about a girl who could repair machines, which she found more relatable, she said, because the girl figured things out by understanding how the parts worked together. Noah thought that was a reasonably good description of most things worth doing. The three of them went to the park on a Saturday in April, the first genuinely warm Saturday of the year, and Ava ran ahead on the path the way she always did, needing to be slightly in front of everything, and Noah and Evelyn came behind her in the kind of easy parallel that they'd developed over months of navigating the world together. He'd stopped thinking about the logistics of this some time ago. It just was what it was, two people who had learned the rhythm of moving through a space together. Ava found the pigeons and began her standard assessment of who among them deserved bread, which was a selection process governed by criteria she hadn't fully disclosed. That one, she said, pointing. Why that one? Evelyn asked. She's waiting, Ava said. The other ones are just standing there, but she's actually waiting. What's the difference? Ava thought about it. When you're waiting, you know something's coming, she said. When you're just standing there, you forgot. She tossed bread to the waiting pigeon with great satisfaction. Noah looked at Evelyn. The April light was doing what April light does. making the ordinary world look briefly like something else. And she was looking at Ava with the expression he'd come to know better than almost anything. The unguarded one, the real one, the one that had been there in the conference room in May a year ago for exactly 3 seconds before she closed it off. Except she didn't close it off anymore. Not with him. Not with Ava. "Hey," he said. She turned to look at him. He didn't have a sentence prepared. He'd learned, with her, that prepared sentences were often the wrong ones, that what she valued was the unedited version, the one that arrived without the professional polish. So he just looked at her in the April light and said what was true. "I'm glad you didn't take the Voss Capital job." She looked at him for a moment. "I'm glad you stayed late that Wednesday in October," she said, "when I came to find you. You came to tell me about the job offer." "I came to find you," she said. "The job offer was what I had to say." He absorbed this. He thought about all the small decisions, the ones that had seemed like ordinary choices at the time and turned out to be the things that made everything else possible. Staying late, knocking on a door. A parking structure at dusk. A hospital at 12:30 in the morning. 4 seconds on a threshold. "Ava," he called. She turned around with bread in both hands and the patient expression of someone interrupted mid-project. "Come here a second," he said. She came. She stood between them on the path with the bread still in her hands, looking up at both of them. "Gerald's in your other coat," she said to Noah, preemptively, "so you can't use him for anything." "I don't need Gerald," he said. "I just wanted you here for a second." She looked at him. She looked at Evelyn. She appeared to assess the situation with the complete seriousness she brought to everything. "Okay," she said. And then, with the instinct that 6-year-olds sometimes have for the exact right thing, she reached up and took Evelyn's hand with her bread-dusty fingers, and reached across and took Noah's hand with the other one, and stood there on the path, holding both of them with the particular patience of someone who has been waiting for this moment for quite some time, and isn't surprised that it's finally arrived. The pigeons moved around them. The park continued its April business. Somewhere nearby, a dog was having a strong opinion about something. The city breathed around them, indifferent and enormous, the way cities are. The three of them stood on the path, hands connected, and it was not a photograph and it was not a perfect moment. Ava's hands were sticky with bread, and Noah's shoulder was doing the thing it did in the cold, and Evelyn's hair was escaping whatever she'd done with it that morning. And it was exactly right in the way that things are exactly right when they're real and present and genuinely yours. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then Ava looked up at both of them and said, "Can we get hot chocolate after this?" "Yes," said Noah. "Can Evelyn pick where?" "Sure," he said. Evelyn picks. Ava looked at Evelyn. "Pick somewhere with big cups," she said seriously. "Gerald likes big cups, for the ambiance." Evelyn looked down at her, this impossible, specific, wonderful child, and she laughed the real laugh. And Noah felt it in his chest the way he'd felt it the first time. The caught-off-guard sound of it, the way it changed everything about her face. Except now he knew it well enough to recognize it before it finished, and to know that it was his to hear as many times as she'd give it. They walked out of the park together in the April afternoon, all three of them, in the direction of wherever Evelyn decided, which was the only direction any of them needed to go.